this and the appeal. Today, we are discussing the killing of 41-year-old Daniel Prude by Rochester police. We are joined by Daniel's brother, Joe, who called 911 to get help for his brother, who was experiencing a mental health crisis. We also have Rochester City Council member Mary Lupian, as well as the attorney for the family of Mr. Prude, Elliot Dolby Shields. And we have organizer Stanley Martin to discuss the new body camera footage recently obtained and released by Free the People Rock, a local Rochester activist group. The footage shows the March killing of Mr. Prude by Rochester police. Now on March 23rd, Daniel Prude, a Black man who had just recently arrived from Chicago, was having a mental health crisis and was naked on the street. His brother Joe called the police for help. Police arrived, they handcuffed Daniel, they mocked him, they put a bag over his head, and they knelt on his back, causing Mr. Prude to suffocate. He died 1 week later from his injuries. Local Black Lives Matter activists yesterday described the killing as an execution by police. The video released by Free the People Rock shows an all too familiar tragedy that comes amidst months of demonstrations against police brutality. Although the medical examiner ruled Daniel's death a homicide, not a single Rochester police officer appears to have been disciplined. One officer investigating the incident said that the police conduct in responding to Mr. Prude appeared to be, quote, appropriate and consistent with their training. Joe Prude has said that he called police to get help for his brother Daniel, but they responded with what he described as cold-blooded murder. Joe said police treated his brother Daniel like a damned animal and covered up what they did to him. The medical examiner's report suggests Mr. Prude was experiencing excited delirium, even though that diagnosis is not recognized by the American Medical Association or the American Psychiatric Association. Protesters are calling for accountability and systemic changes to Rochester police, which has a history of accusations of brutality and mocking people who are in custody. Our guests today are here to talk about what comes next for Mr. Prude's family and what ought to happen next with Rochester's police department. Now, turning first to you, Joe. Thank you so much for being with us today. And let me just start by saying that our hearts go out to you and to your family at this time. And many of us have seen the disturbing video. We've witnessed what was inflicted upon Daniel at a time when he was suffering from a mental health crisis. But those are all things that happened to him. You stated yesterday in the press conference that your brother was much more than those things, that he was a brother, he was a son, he was an uncle. So can you please begin by telling us a bit about who Daniel was?
Like I said earlier, he was a loving son, wonderful brother, and a damn good uncle. Nobody summed it up like what he was actually was, He was really one of those guys that was upbeat, charismatic. And I'm talking about, it's paining me right now just even, just to reflect back onto this. My brother cared about everybody, no matter the circumstances, the race, nothing. He gave you the shirt off his damn back. And for that to be ripped away from you, it's hard for me to adjust to this now. I'm trying my damnness, but it's like I got more pain than I ever had in my life. Just witnessing just witnessing that brutality and all that was displayed to him when he was unarmed wasn't a threat to nobody but himself. How am I supposed to feel? I mean, I'm so speechless right now that it's kind of hurting me more and more as I know I got to talk about this. I got to get it out. I got to let the world know what's going on. And I got to let the community and all the councilmen, everybody, that this type of behavior should not be in no communities, none whatsoever. I mean, do I deserve that type of behavior if I shot and killed the police? No. That type of behavior right there, that's straight savage behavior. That's unnecessary roughness. And it's like, how could you sit there and torment and talk and tease a person that's in a situation where if I couldn't understand it, that was a cry for help. But only thing y'all did was to continue to torment him and make him more agitated. You got a person sitting here crying out for help and he was ignored. And you got a person that called for help. And if I had known that me calling for help would have led to my brother being murdered, I think I'd have just did what I told my lawyer. I should have just tied him down and kept him in the house. But me doing it the right way to get my brother some professional help because I couldn't explain to him, man, calm down, relax. It's going to be all right. I figured I'd give him some medical attention, which I did. He was released with no diagnosis, no nothing. And for me reaching out like that, knowing he should have been observed for at least 72 hours or something so they could get a clear read on how he was functioning. They didn't do that. The only thing they did was, oh, that's another black man with a multiple personality disorder, and you get him on out of here. And put him in a medication and send him right back to my house. No medication, no nothing, prescribed nothing for him. And that episode started again. And I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed the phone and called the police again. My brother's back in that state of delirium, or however they want to explain it, that was a mental cry for help. That wasn't no, however they want to word it.
Thank you, Joe.
Trying. Man, this shit you want,
man. Thank you, Joe. And I mean, it's devastating. And I mean, to just listen to your words and know that you were trying to do everything right to help your brother and get people who were going to help him, and to have this happen, I can only imagine how devastating that is. And how have officials in Rochester responded to your family's pursuit of justice? Because you're saying that this has been really one of the worst things that has happened to you, and you're reliving it now. So how has the city, how have the police officers responded?
Responded. Ain't nothing been said and ain't nothing been done. It's like I said earlier, all this been swept under the rug. They figured that this was a young black male that nobody give a damn about. And they figured he'd be from out of town. And, they like, okay, you got a lot of people migrate to certain places. Maybe he just popped up out of nowhere. And ain't nobody gonna give a damn about him. So let's look at this here from a different angle. Man, they set out to do what they had to do. And that was the intent to kill. Nothing else but the intent to kill. Can't nobody else describe that no better than a family member. That was murder with no second thoughts about it. You mocked him the whole time he was on the damn ground. Come on, who does that?
Thank you.
To respond, I'm sorry, if I can just jump in on the response from the officials.
Sure.
At no point between March 23rd and yesterday did the family ever hear anything from the mayor, from the chief of police. And after the press conference yesterday, the response from the mayor and the chief of police was, we're not going to let the family into the press conference. They barred the family, they barred most of the media, and they barred Stanley Martin and Free the People. And instead, they attacked Stanley directly in front of me, slammed her into the wall, causing her to sustain an injury, and she had to go to the emergency room. And then they had a violent police response where they shot pepper balls at peaceful protesters in front of the public safety building in downtown Rochester. So the irony of the police responding to peaceful protests against excessive force with more excessive force shouldn't be lost on anybody. It's just disgusting.
Thank you, Elliot. And I was going to say, it sounds like you're saying the response was more violence and more attempts to shield what was really going on. And Elliot, I was going to move to you next anyway. So can you take us a step back and really tell our audience about the current situation in Rochester, which you're already speaking to, and really how we got there in terms of this police culture, in terms of this response that we are seeing play out?
Unfortunately, I have many currently pending excessive force lawsuits against the city of Rochester, challenging their long-standing policy and practice of permitting police officers to use excessive force. And how did we get here? We got here because over the decades, the city of Rochester and the Rochester Police Department has failed to adequately train, supervise, and especially failed to discipline officers when they use excessive force against civilians. And especially, and most shockingly, when they use excessive force against civilians when the incident is video recorded and there's no question about what happened. And that failure to discipline officers, especially when the incident is video recorded, sends the message to all of the rest of the Rochester Police Department, to every other police officer, that what happened in that incident is okay. What happened in that incident is appropriate. What happened in that incident is how we train you to act when you interact with civilians, when you're making arrests and when you're taking them into custody. And that's exactly what they determined in the report that you referenced, Summer, at the beginning of the episode, which was written by Sergeant Zenilovic after a thorough investigation, along with investigators Randy Benjamin and Michael Houlihan, who are all high-ranking officials within the Major Crimes Unit, which is the unit of the Rochester Police Department that investigates homicides. And after conducting a thorough investigation, and after interviewing all of the witnesses, all of the involved police officers, reviewing all of their training records, reviewing all of the evidence of the incident, they reached that determination that their actions were appropriate and consistent with their training. And that's outrageous. If that's appropriate and consistent with their training, that's the perfect example of why the police department needs to be defunded and why we need to replace it with something that works, something that's community-led, something where when someone like Daniel PRUDE is going through a mental health crisis, somebody that's trained in dealing with individuals having a mental health crisis response, and they treat him like a human being. They treat him with some basic level of humanity. They can look at a person going through what Daniel was going through and they can say, we know that you're going through something right now. Help is on the way. We're here to help you. Do you need a blanket? The ambulance is coming. Everything is going to be okay. What the police department said by reaching their conclusion that what they did was appropriate and consistent with their training is telling everybody else in the city of Rochester that if you have a crisis like this, the police have license to kill you.
Thank you,
And
Elliot.
that's why the police department needs to be defunded. And that's why they need to be replaced with something else, some other model, which Mary has very been a leader in our city, and Stanley has been a leader in our city, talking about the different types of models that should replace the police department. And that's what we're calling for, in addition to every single officer involved in the incident being fired, and every single officer in the incident being prosecuted by the Attorney General's office. And just to respond, I'm sorry, I'm almost done, to something that the mayor and the police chief said yesterday. Executive Order 147, which was passed by Governor Cuomo after the death of Eric Garner and the failure of the Staten Island District Attorney to indict Daniel Pantaleo. Executive Order 147, which was recently signed into law and made permanent as part of the reform package that repealed Section 50A of the Civil Rights Law, and also made police chokeholds unlawful, says nothing about the internal employment decisions made by the city and the Rochester Police Department. It only deals with criminal investigation by being in the sole jurisdiction of the Attorney General's office. So for the mayor and the police chief to come out and say, we are precluded from proceeding with our internal disciplinary investigation. We're precluded from putting these officers on desk duty. We're precluded from firing them and making sure that they're not interacting with other citizens in the city of Rochester is absolutely false. And for them to come out and say that is not only shocking, but should outrage everybody in the city of Rochester because it's blatantly untrue.
Thank you, Elliot. And we're actually going to start talking about that executive order right now. So turning next to Councilmember Lupien, you were recently asked about Rochester Police leadership and Mayor Lovely Warren's statement that Rochester does not have the same kind of problems as Minneapolis. And you responded that Rochester clearly does have a policing problem. And then in the press conference that Elliot was just discussing, the mayor said that she could not do anything more in the case of Mr. Prude due to the executive order from Governor Cuomo and instructions from the New York Attorney General's office. She said investigating Mr. Prude's case was not in the wheelhouse of the city. Now, how would you assess the mayor and police leaders' responses to the policing crisis in Rochester? And what more do you think Rochester could be doing?
Thank you. You know, the comments that have been made over the last couple of months since the killing of George Floyd, since the murder of George Floyd, have led the community to the conclusion that in my mind, that the police chief and the mayor don't believe that we have those problems here, that we're ahead of the curve, and we have instituted some of the reforms like 8 Can't Wait. But I feel the general interpretation of the comments is that we don't have a problem here. And unless we own up to the things we need to fix in the Rochester Police Department and in systemic racism in our city, we can't band together to solve them. In terms of the executive order, I've read it, and nowhere do I find that it says that it cannot be discussed. You know, I think our legal counsel is interpreting it in a certain way, and I don't agree with that. I believe that we could have said, this happened. You know, Daniel Prude was killed in custody. It's being turned over to the Attorney General's office. And we will alert the community when there's a result. To not discuss it whatsoever, to not brief city council. And, you know, I'm not sure who else knew about this within the administration, but I can tell from the reactions of my colleagues that that they didn't know either. I believe the council president was alerted about 2 weeks ahead of time, but wasn't given the details. So it just really blows my mind that this could have been kept under wraps for so long. I don't, you know, it's not clear to me as well that the executive order precludes the department from making an employment decision about whether or not they put officers on administrative leave or even fire them. You know, it's to me separate from a criminal investigation. Those officers are still in active duty right now, and that needs to that can't be for these men to have done what they did and to have no consequences for 6 months. It's a crime. And so, you know, I echo the calls from the community and from Free the People Rock that these officers be fired, everyone involved be fired, and those responsible for his death be brought up on charges. This cannot stand. And I agree that by saying, by concluding that that the officers acted according to policy and procedure does send the message that this could happen to anyone and there'd be no consequences. You know, and there's still a PSS investigation that won't begin until the Attorney General returns her result of the case. But the investigation into the homicide, they sent that recommendation up to the Attorney General's office. So officially, you know, the chief and the investigators do not think there was anything criminal here. And looking at the video, I cannot understand how they came to that conclusion.
Thank you, Council Member.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Well, actually, Elliot, we're going to move really quick to Stanley, and then we'll come right back to you.
Sure.
Okay. So, Stanley, moving next to you, thank you so much for being with us today as well. And your organization, Free the People Rock, released the video of the police killing Mr. Prude. How were you able to accomplish that? And how did the city respond to your efforts to obtain the video? And then additionally, what are local activists saying that Rochester should be doing about all this? Basically, what do you think needs to happen?
Absolutely. So after months and months of Elliot demanding the video, demanding access to body cam footage, and finally getting it, essentially the video was held hostage and prevented from being viewed by the family for quite a while. We were able to see the video with the family and with Elliot and receive permission to finally release it to the public. We felt that it was necessary for us to let the public know what happened because we believe the murder was covered up by many institutions, ranging from Mayor Lovely Warren, Chief Laron Singletary, and many senior officers within the Rochester Police Department. For me, it's really important to say the names of the officers who were on him and murdered him when he died. Their names are Mark Vaughn, Troy Talladay, who has an extremely violent history, and also Francisco Santiago. They are still employed, they are still active, and we have been able to confirm that Troy Talladay was actually outside the public safety building yesterday, joining with other officers shooting pepper bullets at protesters yesterday. So this is absolutely disgusting, absolutely unimaginable to think that they have murderers just walking through the streets and continuing to terrorize people. Activists in Rochester immediately want them fired. They want them to be held accountable by the Attorney General's office. This has been going on for over 6 months. They've known and accountability is needed immediately. We also want to make sure legislation is passed immediately to ensure that officers who are essentially violence workers are not responding to mental health calls. What we saw in the video was Daniel Prude having a mental health crisis and in need of help. He needed someone to talk to. He needed treatment. He needed support. Instead, he was executed. So we want legislation passed to ensure that police officers are not responding to mental health calls and actual trained professionals who understand and value human life to be present. So that's what we're working on. I know Mary has been very supportive to the family, and she's really one of the only city council members who has been active in making sure that the community's voices are heard and action is being taken to ensure that justice is attained for Daniel Prude and his family.
Thank you, Stanley. And turning quickly back to Council Member Mary Lupien, it sounds like much of what Stanley is discussing in terms of accountability coincides with what you're looking for in terms of accountability. But she also mentioned legislation focused on emergency first responders who are trained to deal with people who are going through a mental health crisis. Can you please tell us your perspective on that sort of legislation, and if you think that that's something that Rochester needs as well?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And we've been having this discussion since June. The city had our budget hearings in June, which is right around the time of George Floyd. And so, the conversation about reimagining policing started then, and we've been having these discussions in the community, and there hasn't been a lot of movement. But now I'm starting to see people shifting their ideas. And I received some model legislation. I've been working with an organization called the Justice Collaborative to see what we can do in our city to have an alternate response to mental health, and to not just have that emergency response full of crisis workers and mental health counselors and drug addiction counselors, but to also have that correspond with a decrease in staffing in the police department. We have 728 officers for a population of 200,000, and from what I have been learning from other cities, we are very overstaffed, and it's just we have to rethink what the officers' responsibilities are. We are asking them to take on every social ill that exists, and they're not qualified, nor do they want to respond to these incidents. And so to replace that response with a real qualified, trained mental health task force is what the legislation calls for. And we're currently, we have some calls into the county to see what we can come together, because it really needs to be a coordinated response between the city and the county. And I don't believe that it would have advanced had it not been for the activists calling for justice.
Thank you, Council Member. And turning quickly back to you, Elliot, I know you wanted to quickly discuss further delays on the part of police in reference to real accountability here. So turning it back to you.
Yeah, the one thing that I think is important to mention about the referral to the Attorney General's office is that didn't happen until April 16th, which was over 2 weeks after Mr. Prude died, and over 3 weeks after the incident happened. They knew he was going to die because he was brain dead on life support. He didn't get oxygen to his brain for 20 minutes as a result of this incident. So they knew that he wasn't going to make it, even though he was on life support for a week before the hospital called the family, and Joe had to do the worst thing that anybody could ever be asked to do, pull the plug and end his brother's life. But for over 2 weeks, the city delayed making that referral and continued with their own investigation, despite the fact that they're legally required to make that referral. So the question is why? We don't know. We don't know.
Exactly.
The mayor and the police chief need to answer for that.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, based on your statements, it sounds like, your view is that this was definitely not a priority for them, and especially not a priority to shine a light on what happened. And just really turning to the last question, we've talked about the lack of accountability. We've talked about alternatives in terms of emergency first responders who are actually trained to deal with these sorts of situations. So I'd love to get everyone's perspective on how creating a system of emergency first responders who are not part of the police force, who are not going to respond in violence, how that will help change things for families, for people struggling with mental health, for the entire community and the police culture in Rochester. So I would love to start first with you, Stanley, on this.
Yes. So when people call 911, they're calling asking for help generally. Officers are not really trained to help. They are trained as violence workers. They're trained to use force. They're trained to be brutal. So we believe that having mental health professionals who are trained to help will allow people to get connected to the services they need. I also believe that when situations happen, people will be more likely to call and receive adequate assistance when it's not the police. We know police have been traumatizing and violating the human rights of Black communities for centuries. So we definitely know that people do not call the police, and when they do in very dire, scary circumstances like that of Daniel Prude's, they end up being harmed or even worse, murdered. So we believe it would allow community members to receive adequate support and receive the help they need if mental health professionals or other health professionals arrive to a scene when help was needed.
Thank you, Stanley. A council member, how do you think emergency first responders or just having that system in place would change the police culture in Rochester?
Well, when police are sent to these incidents, they see the worst of the city, and it reinforces certain beliefs that they may come into our city with. And so I think that, decreasing their exposure and the opportunity for force to be used, I think could have a positive effect on it. But I don't think, honestly, in the culture of the force, that's going to make much of a dent. I think there's many more reforms that need to happen in training and hiring and selection of police officers that will have more of an impact. But I do think that giving the community the control over whether they want a police officer to respond or whether or not they need more specified help is important. So it needs to be a diversion at the 911 center, but also I believe that there needs to be an external number to call so that people can make that choice.
Thank you, council member. Now turning to you, Elliot, I know in your initial statements, you talked about the need to have people respond outside of the police who are healthcare professionals who know how to help people through these sorts of crises. What are your thoughts on this and how will it make a difference moving forward in Rochester?
The city has known that this is a problem for a long, long time. The culture of the police department is if somebody isn't subservient to the subjective level that an officer demands and thinks that they should, the automatic response from the police in Rochester and around the country, but particularly in Rochester, is to use force. In almost every single one of my many civil rights cases against the city of Rochester, that is how the police react. The person doesn't give them the response that they subjectively want from that person, and they throw them to the ground, oftentimes punch them, oftentimes pepper spray them after they're handcuffed, and then they try to cover it up in their reports. That's unacceptable. A department that's been doing that for decades is a department that should no longer exist. And that's why we need to replace it with something that works better and protects our community from the police continually using violence in response to requests for help.
Thank you, Elliot. And turning now to you, Joe, for really our final word on this. How do you think a separate system of people who are trained to help people who are having mental health crises similar to what your brother experienced, how do you think that will help the city? And how do you think that will help protect other families from being in the situation that you and your family find yourself in right now?
Oh, that would be a relief to everybody in the Rochester society, the community, because we would have to be conscious of how that's going to mess up our Rolodex when you got a whole separate entity coming to take care of somebody that's got the professional know-how. But when these other individuals don't, it's an unbalanced moment. So I think it would be justifiable if they do come up with some type of situation or a different program for a response team, not the police. it's a different response team, so be it. The police don't need to be called for nothing else no more because they ain't got nothing but torture, brutality, murder, and oh man. I can't.
No one should have to go through the pain that Joe and his family are going through. And that's why the system needs to be changed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. And thank you so much, Joe, for being with us today and really sharing from your heart, your experience, your family's experience, and giving us further understanding of, who your brother was too, because he was much more than this incident.
Yes, he was.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all our guests for being with us today for this very important conversation. And the nation will be watching and looking to see what happens, looking to see the changes. And we are all holding the Prude family in our hearts right now. Join us again tomorrow for another episode of The Briefing. Thank you.